For 6 months before anyone died at Hinterkaifeck, the family living there kept having the same feeling over and over. The feeling that they were not alone in their own house. Footsteps in the attic when everyone was sitting downstairs. A newspaper from the city that nobody had bought lying on the property as if someone had set it down. A set of house keys that simply went missing. And then just days before the end, a line of fresh tracks in the snow leading out of the dark line of the forest and straight up to the farm, and by the version of the story that has haunted this case for 100 years, not a single track leading back. None of it had come out of nowhere. Months earlier, the family's maid, a woman named Crescens Rieger, had quit, and the reason she gave was that she kept hearing footsteps in the attic and sounds inside the walls, and had become convinced the house was haunted. Those tracks in the snow led toward a machine room door, whose lock had recently been broken, and on the night the family heard the footsteps overhead, the head of the household, Andreas Gruber, climbed up with a lamp to look. He found no one. He searched the whole house. Nothing. I'll be straight with you about that. Not a single track leading back. Because being honest about exactly this kind of detail is the whole point of doing these properly. It's the version 100 years of retelling has polished, and the careful sources only firmly place tracks coming to the farm. Take it as the legend it's become. But here's the part that needs no embellishment, at all the part you should actually sit with. Andreas told his neighbors about every bit of this, the footsteps, the tracks, the missing key. He told people he believed someone was on his land, and he refused every offer of help, and he never once went to the police. A man who thought an intruder was circling his family kept it to himself and locked the door. That decision, that silence, is the first one in this story. It will not be the last. Let me tell you who was inside that locked door, because it matters enormously to where this goes. Hinterkaifeck wasn't a village. It was a single working farmstead sitting alone in the Bavarian countryside, about 70 kilometers north of Munich, half a mile behind Hinter, a hamlet called Kaifeck, with thick woods pressing right up against the buildings. The nearest neighbor was a few hundred yards off across the fields. A person who knew the land could come and go through those trees without anyone ever seeing him from the road. The family that lived there kept to themselves, and they had reasons too. Andreas Gruber, 63, ran the place with his wife, Kazilia, 72. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35, lived with them. Her husband had reportedly died in the First World War, along with her two children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. And on the very last afternoon, a sixth person arrived, a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, 44, who had come to replace the one who'd fled and who would be dead within hours of setting down her bags. She had worked there less than a day. I'm going to handle the next part plainly because it's central, and it would be easy to either sensationalize it or skip it, and both would be dishonest. The Gruber household carried a documented court-recorded secret. In 1915, Andreas and his own daughter, Victoria, had been convicted of incest. It was known in the village, and there were strong rumors, more than rumors to many people there, that little Joseph, the 2-year-old, had been born of that abuse. I'm not telling you this for shock. I'm telling you because a household wrapped that tightly in shame, scandal, and resentment is a household with enemies with entanglements, with people on the outside who had money or pride or paternity bound up in what happened behind those walls. Keep that in your mind as a shape, not a verdict. Because when we get to the question of who did this, the trail is going to lead us straight back into exactly this private wreckage, and then it's going to stop dead. Here is what happened on the night of Friday, March 31st, 1922, as best the evidence ever allowed anyone to reconstruct it. It happened in 2 acts, and the layout of it tells you something. 4 of them old Andreas, his wife, his daughter Victoria, and the 7-year-old were drawn out to the barn, apparently one at a time, lured or led across the yard in the dark, and killed there with heavy blows to the head. The weapon established later was a mattock, a roithaue, a farm pickaxe, and it belonged to the family. It was their own tool. Then, with 4 people dead in the barn, the killer went into the house and finished the other 2, the toddler Joseph in his cot, and Maria, the maid, in her small room. The bodies in the barn were stacked and covered with hay and an old door. I'm going to spare you the full autopsy because the details are as bad as you'd fear, and reciting them would be for effect, not understanding. But there is one finding I won't leave out because it is the thing that has haunted every single person who has ever studied this case, and to skip it would be to sand the truth down into something more comfortable than it was. The pathologist determined that the little girl, 7-year-old Cecilia, did not die quickly. She had lain in the straw of that barn, gravely injured for hours, long enough that she had pulled out her own hair in tufts, lying there beside the bodies of her mother and her grandparents. I'll say that once. We'll carry it for the rest of this without saying it again. And then the killer did the thing that lifts Hinterkaifeck out of the category of ordinary horror and into something that genuinely keeps people up at night. He did not run. He stayed for somewhere between 3 and 4 days while 6 bodies lay on that property. Someone lived there. The cattle were fed and watered across the whole weekend we know, because they were healthy when the bodies were finally found. Food in the kitchen had been eaten. The kitchen fire had been used, and several neighbors looking across the fields over those days distinctly remembered seeing smoke rising from the Hinterkaifeck chimney. Whoever killed this family settled in among them, ran the farm, kept the home fires going, and felt no apparent need to leave. That is not panic. That is not a robbery gone wrong. That is someone who was comfortable there, which is exactly why it took 4 days for the world to notice. The isolation that made the family vulnerable also hid their deaths. Over that long weekend, 2 coffee merchants came by to take an order. Knocked, got no answer, wandered the yard a bit, and left without alarm. The 7-year-old didn't appear at school, but rural absences weren't unusual enough to act on. The family missed Sunday Mass at the church in Weidhofen, where Victoria sang in the choir, and that finally registered because the Grubers didn't miss church. And here is the most surreal detail of the whole discovery. On one of those days, a machinist actually came out to the farm to do repair work, found no one to greet him, and simply did the job and lingered on the property for hours alone, with no idea that the family who'd hired him was lying dead a few yards away. It was only on April 4th that a small group of neighbors, unsettled by the silence and the piling questions, finally walked over to see for themselves. There were 3 of them, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Michael Poole, and Jakob Ziegel. They found the barn door open and the horror inside. And right here in the first minutes of the discovery is a detail that has fueled a century of suspicion, because according to both Pohl and Ziegel, the third man, Schlittenbauer did not behave the way the other two did. While they stood frozen, he was unnaturally calm. He went in. He moved, the bodies handled them, shifted the hay, and the door covering them, reportedly saying he was searching for his little boy among the dead. To his defenders, that's just a hard farmer doing what had to be done in an unbearable moment. To everyone else then, and since it looked like a man who already knew the layout of a massacre, and who, in handling everything, was also disturbing a crime scene before the police could ever read it. And the police, when they arrived from Munich, found a scene already ruined. Word had spread fast across the countryside, and curious neighbors had been tramping through the farm for hours, walking the barn, touching the bodies, some of them almost unbelievably cooking and eating meals in that kitchen, while the dead lay nearby. In 1922, rural Bavarian forensic technique was primitive to begin with. Fingerprinting was barely in use, and the science of a crime scene was in its infancy. Whatever fragile evidence had survived the killer's 4-day occupation was now trampled under the boots of half the parish. The investigators were trying to read a page that dozens of people had already smeared. The first theory they reached for was the easy one robbery. A wandering craftsman, a vagrant, a stranger off the road. They questioned traveling workmen and drifters from the surrounding villages. But that theory died quickly, and the way it died is important, because it's the hinge the whole case turns on. A substantial sum of money was found untouched inside the house. And remember, the killer had lived there for days. Anyone there to steal would have had the run of the place alone for an entire long weekend. They would have found that money in an afternoon. A thief doesn't feed your cattle and leave your cash, so robbery was out. And the moment you take the stranger for money off the table, the field of suspects collapses inward toward a far more uncomfortable place: people who knew this family. People who knew the farm well enough to live on it. People who knew the routine well enough to draw 4 victims out to the barn one by one. People the family's dog wouldn't bark at. I want to pause on that dog because it's the quietest and maybe the most damning detail in the entire case. The Grubers kept a dog. That dog was found alive and unharmed when the bodies were discovered, and it had been on the property the whole weekend. Through the killings and through the days the murderer spent moving around the farm, and by the accounts of those who found it, it was not distressed in the way you'd expect a dog to be around a terrifying intruder. A farm dog that doesn't raise the alarm is a farm dog that knows the visitor. That single fact, more than the footprints or the legends, is what tells you the answer was probably close to home. So who was close to home? The name that has never gone away is Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the same neighbor who led the way into the barn. And I'm going to lay his case out fully, and then I'm going to be fair to him, because he was never charged with anything, and fairness is non-negotiable. Schlittenbauer's farm was the nearest one a few hundred yards off. He knew Hinterkaifeck intimately. He had been Victoria's lover. He had publicly acknowledged himself as the father of little Joseph, and had been paying support for the boy. The two of them had, by several accounts, once intended to marry until Andreas Gruber interfered and the relationship broke apart, after which Schlittenbauer married another woman. By 1922, he had a wife and an infant of his own, and that infant had recently died. And here is the pressure point shortly before the murders. Victoria was preparing to take Schlittenbauer back to court for more support money. So the police looked at a man who was entangled with this family by sex, by child, by money, and by public humiliation, who lived close enough to watch the house from the woods and walk in and out unnoticed. Who could have explained away any sighting of him in the yard as borrowing a tool or visiting Victoria, whom the family dog would never have barked at, and who, when the bodies were found, behaved with a composure that frightened the men beside him? He was named as a suspect within about a week of the killings, and yet he was questioned extensively, repeatedly over years, and the police could never find one concrete piece of evidence tying him to the crime. More than that, the detectives who actually sat across from him reported that they simply could not picture this man as the killer of 6 people, including 2 children. He spent the rest of his life under the shadow of the accusation, and he fought it. He brought slander suits against people who called him the murderer of Hinterkaifeck, and he won several of them before dying in 1941, never charged, never cleared, suspended forever in between. That is the honest position on Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the strongest suspect anyone ever produced, and a man against whom nothing was ever proven. He was also not the only theory, and the others tell you how completely this case became a hall of mirrors. Early on, some wondered whether Andreas himself had killed his family and then died, but the autopsy ruled that out. He had been struck down like the rest. Others spun a darker story that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, who was supposed to have died in a trench on the Western Front, had never actually died, that he had come home, found what had been done to his wife and what was being said about his child, and taken his revenge. There was never any evidence he was alive. And then there was the sheer desperation of the official response, which is its own kind of evidence about how blind the investigation was. Out of options, the authorities had the victims' heads removed after the autopsies and shipped to Munich, where they were handed to a clairvoyant, to a psychic, in the hope that the spirit world might name a killer the living world could not. The clairvoyant reportedly offered only that there had been 2 murderers and that the weapon was hidden somewhere on the property. No names, no use. And those 6 skulls were never returned to the bodies. They were lost in the chaos of the Second World War, which is why, to this day, the Gruber family and Maria Baumgartner lie buried in Weidhofen without their heads. One of the clairvoyant's 2 claims, oddly, did echo something real. About a year after the murders in 1923, the farm was demolished, partly to keep it from becoming a grim attraction, and during the demolition, workers found the murder weapon, a mattock still dark with dried blood hidden in the attic. The attic. The same place the family had been hearing footsteps for half a year. The case has been reopened more than once with better tools than 1922 could offer. In 1986, Munich police students re-examined everything that survived. And in 2007, trainees at the Bavarian Police Academy at Fürstenfeldbruck took the whole file apart with modern forensic and investigative methods, building out the timeline and the crime scene logic. By the reported accounts, they did something striking. They worked through the roster of more than 100 suspects accumulated over the decades and ruled them out one after another until they were left with a single most likely name. And then they chose not to release it because that suspect had living relatives and they would not brand a family on a case they could no longer prove in a court. If you ask which name they were left with, the common assumption points back to Schlittenbauer. But assumption is all it is and all it can ever be now, because every suspect, every witness, every person who walked into that barn is long dead. So strip it all the way down. This was not a stranger. The dog and the untouched money tell you that. It was not a robbery. The days of quiet domestic life among the corpses tell you that. It was almost certainly someone bound to this family by blood or by bed, or by money or by a child. Someone who could cross those fields without fear, who the household animals knew who could live in that house, because in some sense he already belonged to it. The clues, in other words, were never really missing. They pointed somewhere specific. The trouble is that somewhere specific ran directly through the most shameful, most private, most unspeakable corners of this family's life. The incest, the contested fatherhood of a child, the broken engagement, the support money, and in a devout, tight-mouthed Bavarian farming community in 1922, those were precisely the things people did not say out loud. The same shame that had isolated the Grubers in life closed over them in death. Andreas wouldn't even tell the police that someone was stalking his family. The village wouldn't put words to what it already half knew. And so the most haunted house in Germany kept its last and worst secret the way it had kept all the others. The case is in blank. It's redacted. And the thing doing the redacting wasn't a lack of clues. It was silence. It would be easy to file Hinterkaifeck away as a problem of its time and place, a lonely farm, a primitive country police force 100 years ago. Bad luck of history. So let me take you somewhere that had none of those excuses. The very same year, 1922, but an ocean away in a country thick with newspapers and detectives and modern courts. A place where the whole nation would be watching. And where the silence that buried the case was not the silence of a frightened village. It was a silence that somebody could simply afford to buy. On the morning of September 16th, 1922, a young man and his companion were walking a quiet dirt road outside New Brunswick, New Jersey, a disused farm lane that local couples used as a place to be alone when they saw a man and a woman lying beneath a crab-apple tree. For a moment they may have thought the pair were asleep. They were not. What should stop you here is not that two people were dead. It is that two people had been arranged. The man lay on his back in a dark gray suit and a stiff white collar, his Panama hat placed neatly over his face as if to keep the sun out of his eyes. The woman lay beside him, her head resting on his outstretched arm, her hand on his knee, the hem of her dress pulled down as far as it would reach. Propped near the man's foot was one of his own calling cards, and torn into pieces and scattered across the ground around them were love letters. Hold on to that calling card. We will come back to it. The man was the Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, 41, the dignified and well-liked rector of the Episcopal Church of St. John, the evangelist. The woman was Eleanor Reinhardt Mills, 34, a singer in his church choir, married with 2 children to the man who served as that same church's sexton. For years, the congregation had traded quiet rumors about how close the minister and his choir singer had become. The torn letters in the dirt ended the guessing. Both had been shot in the head. And then there is the detail that turns this from an ordinary crime of passion into something colder. Eleanor Mills's throat had been cut, and her tongue and her vocal cords had been removed. The singer, the woman whose voice was her whole gift, had been quite literally silenced. I want to be honest about how to read that, whether it was rage or a deliberate message no one can prove. But it is hard to look at it as anything other than a statement. Now follow the scene where it leads, because the staging is the loudest clue in the whole case. A robber does not pose his victims. A stranger does not carry a man's private love letters out to a lonely lane and tear them up around the bodies like a verdict. Everything about that clearing, the tenderness of the arrangement, the hat, the letters, the silent singer says the killing was personal, that it was about the affair, and that someone wanted that affair lying in the open to be judged. From the very first morning, in other words, the arrow pointed not at a passing stranger, but at the people closest to the betrayal. And to understand why that arrow never landed, you have to understand who the Reverend had married. Edward Hall had married up Steeply Up, his wife Frances Knoll. Stevens Hall came from one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in New Brunswick, with deep money and rumored ties to a great surgical goods fortune. The papers would come to call her the Iron Widow for the stony calm she never lost. Eleanor Mills was the wife of a church janitor. The affair did not just cross a marriage. It crossed a chasm of class. So the most obvious suspects in the world stood in plain sight. From day one, a publicly humiliated, immensely wealthy wife, and the proud, moneyed brothers and cousin around her, Willie Stevens, Henry Stevens, and a cousin named Henry Carpenter. The motive was almost too neat. What was missing was anyone willing or able to build a case that would hold. And the reason it went missing is the heart of this story, because the 1922 investigation was a shambles from the first hour. The bodies lay near a county line, so 2 sets of prosecutors fell to arguing over which one even owned the case, burning the crucial early days on a turf fight instead of on evidence. And while they argued, the scene was simply handed to the public. Word spread and sightseers came by the hundreds. This is the detail I'd ask you to sit with, because it is grotesque and it is the whole game. The crowd that descended on that clearing stripped bark and twigs off the crab apple tree to carry home as souvenirs. They walked the ground, handled things, picked it over. The evidence at the most famous murder scene in the state was not destroyed by a criminal mastermind covering his tracks. It was carried off piece by piece by ordinary people who wanted a keepsake of the sensation. A grand jury heard what little remained and returned no indictments. In a town where the Stevens name opened every door, the case quietly died. Here is where I have to separate what this case is remembered for from what was ever actually proven, because they are almost opposites. Ask anyone who knows the Hall Mills murders, and they will tell you about the star witness at the trial. And the bitter irony is that the single most famous element of the whole affair turned out to be its single weakest piece of evidence. But that trial took 4 years, and a newspaper war to even happen. In 1926, one of the Hearst tabloids, the New York Daily Mirror, seized on the case partly on the back of a lurid new claim from a former Hall household servant, aired in a separate court matter, and hammered it across the front pages until the embarrassed authorities reopened it. The governor ordered a fresh investigation, and a new special prosecutor was brought in from outside the county. And what that new man inherited tells you exactly why the trail had gone cold. Masses of the 1922 evidence had simply vanished in the intervening years. It emerged that the original prosecutor had systematically mislaid vital material, and almost beyond belief, that prosecutor's own brother was caught trying to sell grand jury testimony to a tabloid. The case had not merely been neglected. Pieces of it had been allowed to wander off in precisely the years when proving anything was still possible. What followed in the town of Somerville was less a trial than a national carnival. Reporters came in their hundreds. Refreshment stands and performers set up on the courthouse lawn. And the Reverend's love letters were read aloud in open court for the whole country to enjoy. At the center of the prosecution's case stood one witness, a local hog farmer named Jane Gibson, whom the papers christened the Pig Woman. Her story was vivid. She said her dog had started barking around 9 that night, that she'd seen a figure she took for a thief in her cornfield, and that she had mounted her mule and ridden out after him down the lane. There she claimed she saw 4 people quarreling near the crabapple tree, heard a woman cry, "Explain those letters," saw a struggle over a gun, and heard the shots and the figures she said were Mrs. Hall and her relatives. By 1926, Gibson was dying of cancer. So she gave this testimony from a hospital bed, wheeled into the courtroom on a stretcher, and laid out facing the jury. And this is where the legend collapses. In the front row of the gallery sat Gibson's own elderly mother, who wrung her hands and muttered again and again loud enough for the room to hear, "She's a liar." The defense did the rest. Her account had shifted over the years. First she described 2 figures, later 4. When first asked, she had been unable to identify the defendants at all. And another local farmer testified that she had once offered him money to back up her story. The most famous eyewitness in American crime had built her account on sand. Now remember that calling card propped by the Reverend's foot. It carried the one genuine thread of physical evidence in the entire case, a fingerprint which the prosecution argued belonged to Willie Stevens. This was a thing that might actually have convicted. But fingerprinting was young, the experts openly disagreed, and the defense attacked it hard. The jurors would later be said to have wrestled with that print more than anything else, and still found it too uncertain to hang a conviction on. Because against all of it stood the defendants themselves, calm, composed, well-spoken, wealthy. Willie Stevens, whom the press had painted as a feeble-minded fool, sure to crack, instead came across as gentle and steady and even landed a clever jab at the prosecution. One after another, the family told a short, sincere, unshakable story, and the jury believed them over the dying woman on the stretcher. After a brief deliberation, all were acquitted. Frances Hall then turned and sued the tabloid that had hounded her. The case has sat open ever since. So let me be fair and walk the other doors, because that is the job. Could the family have been innocent? Genuinely, yes, the evidence was thin and corrupted, and the pig woman was a catastrophe. So, who else? A robbery gone wrong is the easy answer, and it is the easiest to dismiss nothing was taken. And robbers do not arrange their victims under a tree with their love letters fanned around them. The husband, James Mills, had a motive as plain as Francis Hall's, but no evidence ever tied him to that lane. And then there is the Ku Klux Klan theory, which is the only rival that fits the staging. A couple of adulterers posed and judged could be read as the Klan's brand of moral theater. The trouble is there was never a shred of evidence connecting them to it, nor any reason these two were singled out. Each door in the end opens onto the same nothing. But step back and look at what actually happened, because it is the lesson the whole case exists to teach. This was not a remote farm with a primitive country police force. This was one of the most watched murder cases in American history, drowning in reporters' money and attention. And it still failed because the 4 years when the evidence was fresh and the witnesses were sharp were exactly the years the case was allowed to go missing. By the time anyone tried, in earnest, the trail was as cold as if it had never been. That is the quiet power of money and standing in a case like this. It need not bribe a single juror or forge a single alibi. It only has to slow everything down. Mislay a file. Here lose interest. There let the gawkers strip the tree and the years strip the rest, until the truth can no longer be proven by anyone. And the one person whose voice might have explained who stood in that clearing and why was the choir singer. Her voice had been cut out of her before she could ever use it. Johnson here, one quick break before the last case, because it's the one that has stayed with me the longest. If these older, slower cases are worth something to you, subscribing and tapping the bell genuinely helps them get made. And if there's a case you want me to take on, the comments are where I'll find it. Now, let me set this last one up properly, because so far we have watched silence protect a killer twice, and both times it was a private silence. The shame of one family, the money of another. Small, human, containable things. The last case asks what happens when the silence isn't a family's at all, when it belongs to an institution, something far larger and far more patient than any single household, with every reason to protect itself and the power to do it. For that one, we move forward almost 50 years to Baltimore in the winter of 1969. Johnson here, one quick break before the last case, because it's the one that has stayed with me the longest. If these older, slower cases are worth something to you, subscribing and tapping the bell genuinely helps them get made, and if there's a case you want me to take on, the comments are where I'll find it. Now, let me set this last one up properly, because so far we have watched silence protect a killer twice, and both times it was a private silence. The shame of one family, the money of another. Small, human, containable things. The last case asks what happens when the silence isn't a family's at all, when it belongs to an institution, something far larger and far more patient than any single household, with every reason to protect itself and the power to do it. For that one, we move forward almost 50 years to Baltimore in the winter of 1969. On the evening of November 7th, 1969, a 26-year-old nun named Sister Kathy Sesnick left her Baltimore apartment to run a few ordinary errands and was never seen alive again. The list for the night was small and human. She meant to cash her paycheck stop at the bakery in the Edmondson Village Shopping Center and pick out an engagement present for her younger sister. She shared the apartment with another young sister, Russell Phillips. The two of them had recently been allowed to leave the convent, wear ordinary clothes, and live a little more like the women they were. Kathy drove off around 6:30. She did not come back. Her car turned up the next day, and I want you to look hard at its condition, because the car is the loudest thing this case ever said, and almost nobody listened. It was found parked at a careless, illegal angle on a street about a block from her own apartment. Not at the shopping center. Not anywhere on her route. Practically at her doorstep. There was mud on the tires and a twig caught near the steering wheel, as though the car had been driven somewhere off-road, that a city errand would never take it. So reason it through. If a random stranger had grabbed her at the shopping center, why is her car back at her doorstep parked badly dirtied as if it had been off-road? It didn't drive itself home. Someone returned it. Someone who knew where she lived, who had the nerve to leave it there in plain sight, and who wanted the morning to read as if Kathy had simply made it home. And then something happened. A stranger flees the scene in the victim's car, or abandons it where he's done. He does not tidy it back to her own street. The car argues against a random predator and points quietly but unmistakably at someone close. For nearly 2 months, that was all there was. On January 3rd, 1972, hunters found her body on a remote, garbage-strewn hillside on the edge of the county near Lansdowne. An autopsy gave the cause of death plainly a fractured skull, a single hard blow to the left temple with a blunt instrument. Whoever killed Kathy Cesnik did it close, and did it by hand. Her murder has never been solved. And she was worth solving. She taught English and drama first at a Catholic girls' school called Archbishop Keogh, and then at a public high school. And by every account, she was the teacher people carry for the rest of their lives. Young, funny, warm, a little unconventional, the one adult, a frightened girl might actually tell the truth to. Hold on to that last part. It becomes the whole case. The early investigation went where these usually go first, to the people closest to her. Detectives looked hard at a priest she had been close to, a man named Jerry Koob. He was questioned, he accounted for his whereabouts, and he was set aside. And then the leads ran out, the headlines faded, and the murder of Sister Kathy Cesnik became just an old, sad, open file. For decades, nothing. It came back to life almost half a century later, and not because of the police. It came back because 2 of her former students, grown women, now had never been able to let it go and began digging into it themselves, eventually drawing a documentary in behind them. And the theory they were chasing is dark enough to reframe everything. The theory is this, that Sister Kathy may have been murdered because of what her students had told her. I am going to handle this part carefully because it concerns the abuse of children, and the man at the center of it was never charged and is now dead. Plainly, a number of former students alleged that the chaplain and counselor at their school, a priest, had sexually abused girls there over years. Some of the allegations reached further and darker into claims the abuse extended to other men. I am not going to dwell on the details. They are allegations, some never tested in any court, and they deserve to be named and then left at that. What matters for Kathy is what those students said she did about it. By their account, she was the one adult who noticed and believed them, who asked a frightened girl point blank whether the priests were hurting her, and who meant to do something. The theory is that she had learned what was happening and was preparing to report it, and that she was killed to keep her quiet before she could. The most chilling claim came from a woman named Jean Weiner, who came forward in 1992 with allegations against the priest, and who said that after she confided in Kathy, the priest took her to see the nun's body in a wooded place and used it as a threat, telling her, in effect, that this is what happens to people who say bad things about others. And here I have to be straight with you about the foundation under that claim, because being honest about exactly this kind of thing is the whole job. Weiner's allegations surfaced as recovered memories, recollections she described as having returned to her years later. That basis is genuinely contested in courtrooms and in the science, and it cuts both ways. It does not make her account false, but it is not the kind of evidence that convicts, and an honest telling has to say so. The claims of trafficking to others rest on the same uncertain ground. I give them to you as serious allegations, not as established fact. I want to be just as clear about the man himself. His name was Joseph Maskell, and he denied everything until he died of a stroke in 2001. He was investigated in connection with the murder and was never charged. In 2017, his body was exhumed so his DNA could be compared against evidence preserved from the scene. It did not match. Police were careful. That did not clear him. They said it only meant the forensic evidence gave no physical link. One spokeswoman put it bluntly: with the DNA excluded, they had reached the end of the road on forensics, and their best hope now was that someone still living would come forward. So if you came for the clean ending, this case will not give it. It may not even have been him. But here is the turn that matters. Step back from the question of any single man, because that was never really the point. What the people digging into this kept colliding with was something far larger than one killer. A case that an institution and possibly some of the very offices meant to investigate it had spent decades keeping quiet. The shape of that silence is in the record. The Archbishop of Baltimore would later acknowledge that the first suggestion of the priest's possible involvement in Kathy's death had reached the Archdiocese back in 1994, while stating there was no record of Kathy ever contacting it and that no charges were ever brought. For years before any of it became public, the Archdiocese had quietly been settling with people who said that priests had abused them. The student's own work pointed to possible collusion among the Archdiocese, the city police, and the state's attorney's office, and to records that should have existed and somehow did not. And consider one more thing the city would rather you didn't connect. Kathy was not the only young woman to vanish around there that month. Just 4 days later, a 20-year-old named Joyce Malecki disappeared and was found dead days after that, a short drive away near a military base. Her killing, too, is unsolved. It fell under a different jurisdiction and sat untouched for so long that her body would not be exhumed for fresh examination until 2023. 2 women days and miles apart, both swallowed by the same quiet. So, whether or not that priest ever swung the weapon, this is the thing that truly buried Kathy Cesnick's case. Not a shortage of suspects, The car alone narrowed those from the first morning. Not a shortage of leads, a shortage of will inside institutions powerful enough to decide what would be looked at and what would be left alone. This was not the silence of shame in a frightened household. It was the silence of an institution large enough to outlast the detectives, the witnesses, and the victim herself. And yet I'll end on the part that is almost unbearable and almost hopeful at once. The people who finally forced this back into the light were not detectives and not prosecutors. They were her former students, ordinary women in their 60s and 70s at kitchen tables with boxes of old files and a Facebook group doing patiently and stubbornly the work the institutions around them would not. The murder is still officially unsolved, but the silence that sealed it for half a century is not. They broke that themselves, for the teacher who, by everything her girls believed, had been ready to do exactly the same for them.